As I said, Pastor Lance is gone, and I was thankful that the last time he had me preach, I had to preach on submission. He gave me a little bit of an easier selection this time. So we still are preaching out of 1 Peter. So I wanted to tell you kind of a little story before we get started. When I was a little girl, my dad, and I actually have one of my dad's watches here, he wore a big watch like this. It was always big, it looked bigger to me when I was younger. It's not as big now, but it was always shiny. He always had it on, unless we were going swimming or to the beach. He'd take it off and put it right back on. And the thing about that is it really gave me a lot of comfort. It was kind of a symbol of my dad being in charge and keeping track of what was going on, and it was just comforting to me. I knew that Dad would keep us on track. And for those of you younger folk, we didn't have cell phones then, so we couldn't just check the time on our phones. You had to have a watch. Watches were kind of a big deal to my family. And then I remember one of my birthdays when I was young. We happened to be in Disney World, and it was my birthday, so it was like a double great thing. And I got a watch, my first watch to wear. Of course, it was a Mickey Mouse watch, so it had, and actually I have that watch too. So Mickey Mouse's hands are pointing out the time, and I thought I was really grown up. I was probably 7, but I thought I was really cool to wear the watch. And then when I was in high school, my grandmother decided that perhaps the Mickey Mouse watch wasn't, quite as grown up as I had thought it was at 7. And she got me a really nice gold watch. That one I don't actually have anymore. But it had like a little tiny, tiny diamond chip at the 12. And I only wore that at special occasions because I was afraid I would lose that. When cell phones became really popular, I stopped wearing a watch for quite a while. That and my kids, like Khalees, when she was small, would tug on them and pull on them and just cause problems with them. But then the Apple Watch came out, and I have an Apple Watch, and that was even better because I could keep time, but I could check text messages, I could listen to music, I can answer the phone on it. Pretty cool stuff. But I have mine set to vibrate, doesn't make noise when it rings, but that can also become kind of a problem. What I realized after a while is that it was interrupting a lot of the time that I had to focus on things that were more important. So lately I've been turning off the notifications on my watch. You know how technology is meant to make things easier for us, but sometimes it causes more problems. Like when I'm studying, I was studying for the sermon, and people kept trying to send me, I got notifications, my kids are sending funny Snapchats, or Khalees and Zach are sending pictures from their honeymoon that they just got back from. Or I have people trying to text me things. And so it's constantly interrupting that flow of thinking. Or at times when I'm trying to have a conversation with someone and it's buzzing and interrupting me, and I try really hard not to look at it and focus on the person I'm talking to, but still in the back of my mind, I know there's something there I have to go pay attention to. So sometimes I feel like my technology is stealing more of my time than it's really saving. So we live in a culture that's obsessed with time. But so often we fill our time with really unimportant things that waste our time and fail to focus on what really matters. Sometimes I feel like I'm drawn in to focus on things that are really the least important things because it's dramatic. I get worked up about events that in the long run really aren't all that important. And the more I'm drawn into the drama, the worse my attitude can be. Is anybody else there with me? Is that just me? Okay. So our attitude really affects the way we use our time. The good news is that we can change our attitudes to align with Christ. Now, this doesn't come naturally. We have to be really purposeful to cultivate the kinds of attitudes that will help us use the rest of our time the way God intends. Peter describes these attitudes in our text for tonight, and I'm going to need a few people to help pass these out. Hey, Ross, will you go check? Does anybody else feel like it's hot in here, or is it just me because I'm nervous? Yeah, will you go check the temperature and see if it got turned down to 70? There's 2 of them. 70, yeah. So we know that we're studying the book of 1 Peter, and this is all about how to endure the suffering that Christians can face. Last week, Pastor Lance went over chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. And Peter talks then about viewing suffering like Jesus viewed it. And in next week's services, Pastor Lance will be preaching out of chapter 4, verses 12 through 19. And it talks about suffering for being a Christian. And spoiler alert, that starts with the phrase fiery furnace. So that sounds to me like that's going to be a little disturbing. But in the middle of these two warnings is our text for tonight. Peter deliberately talks about the importance of Christian community. Couched in between his discussion of suffering, he reminds us to have hope in the midst of suffering and then gives us some practical advice on how to spend our time to bring God glory. Being in Christian community is a really important part of that. So let's read through 1 Peter chapter 4, 7 through 11. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. That's kind of the hard part, the without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks oracles of God. Whoever serves, as one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. So Peter goes through several attitudes that we really need to have to be using our time wisely. And the first one he talks about is an expectant attitude, and that's in verse 7. In verse 7, Peter starts by mentioning the end times, the end of all things is at hand. Peter is challenging us to remember that we don't know the day or the hour of Christ's coming, but we know that he is coming. We should view our lives and the time that we spend in light of Christ's return and use the rest of our time wisely. If we really believe in eternity, then we will make the best use of our time. If we are convinced Jesus is coming, then we will live prepared lives. The important thing is that we will see the Lord one day and will stand before him. How we live and serve today will determine how we are judged and rewarded on that day. So within this context, Peter encourages us to be self-controlled and sober-minded. Now, Paul mentions this as well. 10 different times in his pastoral letters, he uses the phrase sober-minded. So we know when something is repeated over and over, it's something we really need to pay attention to. The word sober often takes us right to thinking about addictive behaviors, but the idea here is really much broader than just that. Being sober-minded means keeping your mind steady and clear. Now, of course, drug and alcohol use does affect this, but so does taking on too many things to do and being too busy. So does focusing on the wrong things and letting yourself get stirred up by those things. So does living in chaos. It means facing things realistically and not spending most of your time worrying about the what if this happens, what if that happens. It means having a purposeful life, not just kind of flitting from here to there and trying different things and never really moving forward. It means that we can exercise restraint and not be impulsive. It means our judgment is sound. And that really is talking about just not our judgment in doctrine, but also about practical things of life. When we live a frenzied, chaotic life, when we don't take time to pray and seek God, we aren't self-controlled or sober-minded. Our world is really susceptible to wild thinking. If you watch the news, you've seen this. Everyone is offended. Everything becomes more and more dramatic as it's discussed. In that kind of world, the church must be sober-minded. We have to balance that. But don't be discouraged because we all fall into this trap at times. I'm preaching to myself here. And the key is we can't do this on our own. Being self-controlled isn't something that we have the power to do by ourselves. The key is we have to rely on Christ to renew our minds. One of my very favorite verses is Romans 12:2. It reminds us, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. We have to allow the Lord to renew our minds to remain self-controlled and sober-minded. We have to allow him to renew our minds on a daily basis, sometimes an hourly or minute-by-minute basis, depending on what's going on. Peter also tells us that being self-controlled and sober-minded will affect our prayers. He says in the verse, for the sake of your prayers, you should be self-controlled and sober-minded. Being too caught up with worldly affairs and being confused by worries can really ruin your prayer life and spoil your relationships with God and with other Christians. If our prayer life is confused, it's because our mind is confused. Now, interestingly, in the King James Version, instead of the phrase, for the sake of your prayers, they use watch unto prayer. The word watch carries with it the idea of being alert, being awake, being self-controlled. And it really makes sense that Peter would bring this up because he's had experience in failing to persevere in prayer. In Mark 14, Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he takes Peter, James, and John with him, asking them to remain there and watch as he moved a little farther on into the garden to pray. And then we pick up in verse 37, and he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, if I got in trouble once for something, I sure tried really, really hard not to get in trouble for the same thing again. But here they've gone through this thing twice. Peter went to sleep when he should have been watching unto prayer. Peter knows that this is going to be hard for us because he's had that experience. But he also knows how important it is for us to be serious about our prayers. The goal should be to pray passionately and consistently. There isn't room in a Christian's prayer life for complacency. Now, I think I've mentioned to you before that I grew up Catholic, and there were many wonderful things about the way I grew up, but learning to pray was really hard because as a Catholic kid, I memorized prayers, and we recited those over and over. But I don't know, I'm sure someone tried to teach me the meaning behind it, but some of the words were so confusing as a child. I don't know that I ever really grasped the meaning of them at that point. I don't want my prayers now to be just reciting words. I want my prayers to be fervent. I want my prayers to be connecting to God and helping him connect to me and change me. And if we're not praying in a way that's changing us, then we've got to dig a little deeper. The next attitude that Peter addresses is having an earnest attitude toward other Christians, and that comes from verses 8 and 9. If we are really looking for Christ's return, then we will think of others and will relate to them well. Knowing that our time may be short gives us the proper perspective to treat others the way they should be treated. Love is the mark of a believer in this world, and we need to make sure that other people see that in us. And it's hard. It's hard sometimes to love people who aren't very lovable. Especially in times of testing and persecution, Christians need to love one another and be united. But you know that the first thing that Satan wants to do is divide us. I've spent years watching basketball. Kevin coached basketball at the high school level, and all of the kids played. They started at about third grade on up through high school. One of our kids even played in college. The players always have a game plan that the coach has given them. The buzzer rings, the time starts on the clock, and they try to work together to implement that plan. At times, the plan falls apart. The coach will call a timeout, and all the players head back to the bench. Good coaches will take time to correct when needed, but to also encourage, to remind the players that they know what to do, that they have a plan, and that their coach believes in them. That's exactly how the church can and should function. When God's people gather together on a Sunday or a Wednesday, we share a love that is deep and practical, gracious and forgiving. We look back at the week just gone, hearing God's well done for the good work we've done, his forgiveness where we've strayed, where we've made mistakes. We remember he was with us on the court the whole time, and we thank him for that. And then we get set for the next play ahead, how we want to approach it, who we're going to live for when the buzzer rings again. That encouragement unlocks the stamina that we need to continue in ministry. Belonging to a church family really matters. As you live for God week in and week out, you will see him working through you, and you'll see him working through your Christian family. You might forget the game plan. You'll certainly take some hits. You need your Christian brothers and sisters, and they need you. So what should our attitude be towards each other? Well, verse 8 says we should have earnest love. The word earnest makes me think of that athlete striving to reach the goal, pushing ahead, pushing things aside that aren't going to help, and pressing on to get to the end of the competition. Earnest love doesn't come naturally or easily. Isn't it funny how all those things we need to be doing are things we really can't do on our own? I think God intended it that way. He wants us to rely on him. Loving this way is something we have to work at, just the way an athlete practices his skills. It's not just an emotional feeling, and I think that's where some people get a little tripped up. We stop feeling the emotion and we think, oh, that love, that concern is gone. But really, Christian love is a dedicated will to love. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we have to press on and ask God's help to love people. Christian love means we treat others the way that God treats us. Now, this was always a big thing with our kids because they wanted to treat each other the way the other one treated them. But that's not the way it's supposed to work. We're supposed to treat others the way God treats us, even when someone's not treating us right. And to do that, we have to have God's help. Peter also tells us in verse 8 that love covers a multitude of sins. Now, this can be a little tricky. It doesn't say that it condones sin. If we love someone and they're living in sin, we hurt for them and we hurt for the people that they are hurting. But love will cover that sin, and it motivates us to support them and help them. But it shouldn't motivate us to spread their sin around to everybody else. And I think that's what they're meaning by covering sin. And you know that story of Moses in the Bible where he shamefully uncovers himself, but the people who really are showing him Christian love come and cover him up. And that's the kind of covering they're talking about here. I found this quote as I was studying, first encouraging in the first sentence, and then the second sentence I found it a little convicting. Where love abounds in a fellowship of Christians, many small offenses, and even some large ones, are readily overlooked and forgotten. And I thought, yeah, that's awesome. Then here's the next one. But where love is lacking, every word is viewed with suspicion. Every action is liable to create misunderstanding, and conflicts abound, much to Satan's delight. I'm afraid that too often I fall into that second category where I start to worry about something someone said and what they really meant by it. You guys probably don't get that at all, but ladies, you all relate, right? We've all been there at some time or another. I don't want to be that kind of Christian. I don't want to not love in that way. Satan wants to destroy our unity as a body of believers, and Peter is reminding us that loving each other earnestly can protect our unity. In verse 9, we're reminded to use hospitality. Now, this is not just talking about having someone over for dinner and then sending them on their way. Hospitality comes in all kinds of forms. I also saw a quote, let's see if I can remember it correctly. Hospitality is when you bring someone into your home and treat them well, even though you wish they were in their home. That's not the kind of hospitality we're supposed to be practicing. Earlier in our marriage, I think we were probably our 6th anniversary maybe, we went to the Bahamas. Kevin and I took that trip to celebrate our anniversary, and while we were there, we decided to go to church. It's really cool to go out and meet some of the local people, and it was an Assembly of God church there. They had advertised that they would come to the resorts and pick up people and take them to church, and we thought, awesome, that'll be really fun. So The young man who came to pick us up was really anxious to tell us all about our church, his church. And Kevin's always great about asking lots of questions. And I usually just sit and kind of, listen to it. It's really fun. When he was talking about his church, one of the questions we asked was, well, how many people come to your church? And I thought the young man said, around 400 on a Sunday, and they had a huge choir. But his accent was really thick, and so I wasn't exactly sure if I'd heard him correctly. And then when we got there, I was surprised to see in this huge sanctuary, there were about 30 people. And that counted the organ player and the 6 people on the platform who were in the huge choir. So they started singing at the beginning of service, and I thought, well, I just must have understood him wrong. But over the next hour, as they continued to sing, so that was a whole hour of worship service before we even got to anything else, people continued to file into the sanctuary. Now remember, as Americans, we tend to be a little more time conscious, but you get a little farther south, you get into Mexico, the Bahamas, it's not the same thing. And they just kind of showed up whenever they could get there. People continued to join the choir. The piano player showed up about a half hour after service started and just kind of walked up there and started right mid-song playing along. And this was just fascinating to me. But the other thing that was really interesting is the congregation started to grow and grow. And he was right. There were around 400 people there by the time the first hour was over. Is that the people didn't just come in and go right to their pew and stay by themselves. They came in and they greeted everybody. And we stood out a little bit there. We were visitors, and so they would come up to us, and they didn't just shake our hand. They would hug us, and the women were kissing me on the cheek, and they were inviting us to go to lunch with them. I mean, they were over the top friendly. Now, I'm not suggesting that you all arrive late to service, okay? We're still in the States. I'm not suggesting that our service lasts 3 hours, because that's how long that one lasts, or that we all need to be super affectionate at each other. I don't need you guys to come up and kiss me on the cheek. But I do think there's something there for us to learn. As Americans, we're so very conscious of time and everything we have to get done. And this isn't always a bad thing, but sometimes I'm guilty of focusing more on time than people, and that is a bad thing. Imagine if I didn't show up to lead worship service this Sunday until a half hour after the service had started. Imagine if our service tonight was going to last 3 hours. Don't worry, it won't. The Bahamians greeted us warmly and wanted to get to know us. They wanted to get to know us more than sit down and sing the songs or get to the sermon. They were there to make connections with people. They were more focused on being Christ to others than who was late or how long the service was lasting. And they loved their Christian brothers and sisters and were grateful just to be there worshiping God with little concern for time constraints or the cultural differences. I know there are some things I can learn from that. Peter goes on in verses 10 and 11 to encourage the third attitude, and that's of sharing our gifts. God has given each of us specific interests, abilities, and talents that he expects us to use in serving him and others. He didn't just hand out gifts and say, go do whatever you want. He wants you to use those in service. These abilities are typically related to interests and opportunities that God gives you, even if you feel inadequate, especially if you feel inadequate. The Lord has given you those gifts, and he wants you to share them. God can work through you. Years ago, I didn't seek out to be on the platform singing. I had a worship leader come to me and say, I really need you. And I said, oh, no, that's not something I need to be doing. But he encouraged me and finally got me up there. My first Sunday on the platform was Father's Day, and we had a Father's Day choir. So it was Micah's dad, John, Karen Allen on the piano, me, and like 50 guys up there singing. I felt really inadequate. But it's been really fun to see the things that God can work through this. Now we've got John's daughter, Micah, helping us with worship. So I just think that's kind of a cool circle of events. Though some of our gifts might seem less important than others, they are all significant to God because they provide ways to contribute to his purposes. There are so many of you that do little things behind the scenes, things that nobody else knows you're doing, but those things keep everything running the way they should be. Those people who are downstairs greeting, the person who comes and fills our communion cups and gets everything ready to go for our communion Sunday, the people who are in the nursery holding little babies. And you know, little babies sometimes come with vomit and other unpleasant things. Those people, we appreciate you when you are filling in and doing those things that other people just don't always see. We joyfully are to spend ourselves on others. We use our gifts, our skills, and our resources to build up our brothers and sisters, recognizing all that we have comes from God. Using our gifts in service isn't to promote pride, but it's to further God's glory. Ultimately, our best efforts, not being perfect, but our best efforts at service are the highest form of gratitude that we can offer God for what he's given to us. And I think that's pretty cool. All of this kind of links into another of my favorite verses in Ecclesiastes 3, 9 through 13. And the heading in my Bible is, it's the God-given task. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in his time. Also, he has put eternity into a man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. Micah, would you come on up and play something? So Peter's emphasis on hope and the glory of God encourages us to be faithful today in the work God has given us to do. He's giving us practical steps to take that will help us remain faithful through difficulty and suffering. He's showing us how to use the rest of our time for God's glory. My question for you tonight is, how can you use the rest of your time for God? What can you commit to this week or this month or this year to make your time count more for eternity? Here's the hard one. What can you release so your time is better spent? We have about 9 minutes left, and I'd like to invite you to find a place of prayer this evening. Ask God to renew your mind. Ask him to lead you in how to use the rest of your time for his glory. Come on up for prayer.